Bonjour and good morning. Welcome to WASA Distance Education Center and PLAR History. So we're still looking at registrations. So do register for the 2024-25 courses at WASA, especially students who are returning PLAR students. You still need to reapply for the courses. We're into week 2 of the PLAR history. So if you're looking at your WASA calendar, you can see it says week 2, and today is Tuesday. Whoops, I have the wrong date here. Yeah, that's right, Tuesday, September 10th. So that's where we're at. Tomorrow, Bonnie and I will be traveling to Wapakika, so that's on September 11th. Wapakika, and that means that PLAR English will not be running at its usual time on Wednesday from 11 till noon. But Bonnie, I think, has already made arrangements to do a makeup class. When you do register for the 2024-25 courses, you can use the online application form. Just a reminder to students, if you don't have your status card number, or if you don't have a phone number, you can use zeros to fill the application. So where it's asking you to put in your phone number or to put in your card number and you don't have it with you, especially if you're reapplying, just put in zeros because we already have a copy of your information. If you don't want to do that, you can also call the office. You can call 807-737-1488, and you can speak to Candace regarding PLAR, or you can talk to Michelle if you're looking at signing up for other courses. There will be application draws for students who register, and this will also apply to DECs who register their students, and we will keep you posted on what the prizes will be. We will also continue to do end-of-term draws for students who submit work. So if you're submitting work already, your name is going into a draw, and that will happen during each term. So we have terms 1A, 1B, 2A, and 2B. So you have your name entered every time you submit work, and your name will also go into another draw if you earn a credit. Okay, I just want to go over some important changes for new and returning PLAR students. So for those of you who missed our meeting on Friday, here are the changes. So the big change is that PLAR students have the option of completing an open book culminating activity instead of doing the key questions in the lessons. So again, you have that option that you can do an open book culminating activity instead of doing the key questions in the lessons. Now what happens if you have already completed a lesson? So let's say you completed lesson 1 for PLAR history, lesson 1 key questions. You can still let me know and tell me that, hey, I'd like to do the open book culminating. I did lesson 1, I feel confident I can do the test or the culminating activity. That's all you have to do. Okay, the culminating activity then will be emailed to the DEC. Your DEC does not have to supervise you, and you do not have to do it at the Learning Center. That means you can take the culminating activity home to complete. Successful students, so the passing mark is 50%, okay, and above. So the minimum is 50. So successful students will receive their equivalent credits, and then you can proceed to your senior PLAR and then go on to completing your senior credits. If the culminating activity is not passed, then the key questions in the lessons must be completed. Okay, that will help you prepare for the culminating activity so that you can retake the culminating activity. Students are permitted several attempts to pass the culminating activity. Okay, your distance education coordinator they should inform already registered PLAR students about the change. So if your DEC has not informed you yet, you can ask them about it. And new PLAR students will be informed upon completing an application. So there are 5 culminating activities that are available. There's one for PLAR history, there's one for PLAR English, one for PLAR science, one for PLAR geography, and one for PLAR math. So check with your DEC how many of these components you need to do to complete your equivalent credits for grade 9-10. Some of you might only have to do the PLAR math to complete. Some of you might have to do just the PLAR history, and then there are some of you who have to do them all. So note that students who get their equivalent credits from passing the test only will not qualify for the GWL 3.0 credit. Okay, you have to do all the lessons and all the tests if you also want the GWL 3.0 credit. So again, if you have any questions about the new changes, you can call Bonnie or myself or Candace. So all the PLAR packages are the same. So if you choose to do the lessons, the packages are the same whether you register for radio, Zoom, or IL. And PLAR students who are choosing to do the lessons, you can continue where you left off. So if you left off in lesson 2 from last year, you can continue on and do lesson 3 for this year. You will also notice that on each of the cover pages, so if you look at the PLAR history, lesson 1 and key questions, lesson 2 and key questions, and lesson 3 and key questions, all the information is there that you need. So if you want to call the WASA studio, the number is there. If you want to listen to us on radio 91.9 FM, that's local here, you can listen on that channel. If you have Bell Express View channel, Bell Express View, the channel is 972. So remember, these are only audio. That means you won't see what I'm doing on the screen. You can also use my Zoom link. That's available there for you. Now, I found out from some of the learning centers that some computers, you might have to download the Zoom app each time. And then there's others that it's already there. You just click on it. It'll download Zoom for you. Choose my meeting ID. And then there's a passcode. Or if you put my name, it should come up. The office number is there for you as well. The toll-free number. My extension number. So if you want to call me. Fax number. My email. My Facebook or YouTube. Same profile to make it easier. And if you want to use the Google Classroom, remember there are 2 separate codes, one for using the NNEC Schools account. So if you have an email with NNEC Schools, then you use that account. If you already have or you're using your personal account, the code for that Google Classroom is shown on there. So all the info that you need is on that page. Okay, it's on all of the cover pages, whether it's a study guide or the lessons. So if you decide to do the culminating activity, you might want to do some review. You can go to the PLAR Science and PLAR History Geography videos or classes. You can watch them on YouTube. There are playlists just to make it easier for you to access the classes. So for example, the PLAR Science, there are 17 videos there. That's from last year, PLAR Science 2B. The PLAR Geography 2A is there as well, and the full class classes for PLAR History is there from Term 2A. when you download the classes, you simply open the lesson that you want to view, and then the key questions that you might want some help with. And if you don't have access to Wi-Fi or internet, then you can request a USB of classes. Remember, all students registered with WASA, you have access to a G Suite account. If you try your email and it says you have the wrong password, or if you forget your password, don't worry, I can reset it. Or if your email has not been activated, I can activate your email too if you'd like. Sometimes if you try to get to your email and it won't let you, it might say denied access, or it might give you another prompt. Just make sure that you sign out, especially if you already have a Google account. So sign out, okay, of all accounts. When you sign out, then you can start over, and then you can put in your NNEC Schools email and then put your password. Okay, once you're ready to submit your work, or if you have your culminating activity completed, here are some ways you can submit it to me for marking. You can scan your work, you can use your iPhone Notes app, and then email or send through Messenger. 2 ways. You can, like I said, take a picture, or you can scan it. So scan, we'll just scan the page so it looks like this. You don't have any background. And then the picture, okay, depends on how you take the picture. You will also take the background, whichever. So if you put it on the table and you have papers on the table, you can possibly be taking the stuff that you also have on the table. Okay, but if you scan it, it will only scan the page. It'll capture just the square part of your culminating or your key questions. Once you do that, you can email it to studentwork@nnec.on.ca. Make sure you CC it to the teacher who will be marking your culminating or your key questions. Another option, you can send it through Google Classroom, or if you want, if you're working on your key questions or your culminating, you can also use your Google Sheets, and you can just share it to the teacher that's marking your work. So when you first look into to doing Google Sheets, it'll say private to only me. You have to click the button, the lock button, and say share. When you share it, you type in my email, because that's the person you're sharing it with. So you can share lesson 1 key questions, or you can title it share your culminating. And then I will get an email that says the student shared their work with you. Or you can have your DEC scan or fax it for you. You can also drop it off if you're around Sioux Lookout or in Sioux Lookout. We do still have the WASA outdoor mailbox, or you can simply knock on the door and we will take your key questions or culminating from you. Make sure you have your name, okay, on your work so we know who it came from. And of course, if you have other concerns or questions, please do not hesitate to contact me. So we're into week 2. We are continuing lesson 1, Canada 1900 to 1939. And if you have submitted work, so if you have chosen to do the key questions, if you have submitted work, we have completed key question 1 already. We did matching the correct letter to the 4 concepts of historical thinking, or if you did last year's format, you have to identify and describe the 4 concepts of historical thinking. And then number 2, we did the Boer War. What was the significance of it to Canada? So that was key question 2. And we also did key question 3, give 2 examples of what women were required to do as immigrants. So we did 1 to 3 so far. Okay, continuing with our learning goals. So keep this in mind, that you can identify events of historical significance from the early 20th century. We will also look at understanding the effects of the residential school system, and I can describe Canada's contributions during World War I. So page 11 for immigration and racism, page 12 for the Reciprocity Issue, and then page 13 for Indigenous Peoples in the early 20th century, treaties, and then residential schools on page 14. So what you will notice that when I'm going through the slides here, so these are my presentation slides. This supplements your lesson 1 with additional material. So if you're not sure what page I'm on, just simply ask me. I usually tell you which page I'm working on. Your lesson book or your lesson notes, most of it, some of it might have pictures on the pages, but it does take up a lot of space, so that's why it may look different, but the information is the same. Okay, so women and immigration, so page 11. The key word here is expectations. So what were they expected, or what did society believe they should be doing? So in the early 1900s, women from the British Isles, they were welcomed to Canada. Remember we talked about how some people, especially Chinese immigrants, okay, they were required to pay a head tax when they came into the country. Okay, they were also prohibited from coming into the country. There was a policy by the government that said no Asian immigrants were allowed. But in this case, women from the British Isles, okay, they were encouraged to come to Canada. Okay, they were needed to provide families so that they can help run farms and clear the land. They were expected to take care of the entire household. They were expected to do many of the farm chores. So notice the picture here. This person or this woman is milking a cow. They were also expected to bear many children. They didn't have any right to property. They were also expected that they can only work in specific jobs. So if they were in the city, women that were employed, they worked as cooks, maids, nurses, and teachers. Again, no freedom and little privacy. They were not allowed to enter many professions that men worked at. However, factories opened and women were allowed a few more freedoms, and now they were able to earn their own money. Okay, so that's back in the early 1900s. So there are some useful links that you can go regarding immigration. This is from the Canadian Council for Refugees. It's 100 years of immigration to Canada, 1900 to 1999. So remember, we look back in 1900, we had 41,681 immigrants were admitted to Canada. Okay, we're not going to look at all of them. Let's just look at some of the highlights here. 1903, Chinese head tax increased to $500. So from 1901 to 1918, 18 million was collected from Chinese immigrants. And then the Immigration Act in 1906. So some of the rules here says the act gave the government legal authority to deport immigrants within 2 years of landing. (1906 to 1907), we had 4,700, mainly from India, arrived in Vancouver. So again, arrivals of Japanese and Chinese increased more than 2,300 in British Columbia in 1907. Okay, so you can check that out yourself. Or you could also look at the history of immigration to Canada. This one is just 1 minute and 18 seconds on YouTube. And then finally, you can check out the redress at last for Chinese head tax. We talked about that, how Stephen Harper apologized, okay, for the Chinese head tax. Okay, next up on page 12 is the reciprocity issue. So the word reciprocity means the practice of exchanging things with others for mutual benefit, especially privileges granted by one country or organization to another. Looking at the map, so in red, okay, that's Canada, and in blue, that's USA or United States. And you see the arrows pointing up to Canada, and you have the arrow from Canada pointing down, okay, to the States. So reciprocity, so they're practicing exchanging of things. So let's look at that on page 12. So the reciprocity issue or agreement is a free trade agreement that was negotiated in 1911. So it was between Prime Minister Laurier, so the two leaders, and then President Taft of the United States. So what happened here is that the two countries would be allowed to trade goods without any additional taxes. Okay, so that's the reciprocity. But it was a controversial agreement. That means not everyone agreed. It would lead to an economic and political takeover of Canada, and that Canadian, they believe that Canadian resources should stay in Canada. So if you're looking at the political picture, on the left-hand side, you have, that's Laurier. So what he's doing is he's trying to capture, okay, there's a picture of a cow, and the cow is labeled as Canadian resources, so he's trying to hold it back. And then you have President Taft in the background. So there's the US President. He's holding a bucket because he wants to milk the cow. Okay, so that picture or political cartoon is depicting that Canadian resources should stay in Canada. An election in 1911 happened, and Laurier's government was defeated by Robert Borden and the Conservative Party, and they disagreed or disapproved of this reciprocity agreement between the two countries. So we can see here that reciprocity and free trade, okay, has been an emotional issue in Canadian history because it clashed. There was a clash between two opposing forces. One is that they wanted it for beneficial economic ties with the United States, but then they feared that the closer economic ties would lead to American domination and annexation. Okay, so what we get from here is that reciprocity in trade is when you have two countries who agree to help each other by lowering taxes and barriers on goods so that they could trade freely with one another. This makes it easier and cheaper for both countries to sell and buy products from each other, and really the goal is to boost their economies by increasing trade. So what we saw in the previous page, here's another political picture, the Canadian raw materials. So you have the pig here, it says United States Trust. There's the Canadian raw materials, so the pig is eating it. The Canadian interest is depicted or represented by the piglet. Okay, and the piglet is crying. So this is a warning, that is a campaign poster that's warning that the big American pig will gobble up the benefits of reciprocity. And this was proposed by the Liberals. On page 12, you will see support question number 2. Again, the support questions are for practice, so you can check these out. Number 3 is, what was the reciprocity issue? When was it negotiated? You can view the answers at the end of the lesson on page 30. So here you have the support question 2 answers. When you look at the support question answers, okay, this gives you an idea to how to answer the questions. Answer it using complete sentences. Okay, let's now look at pages 33 to 34, and let's look at our own key questions that you have to submit. Okay, I want to point out when you are completing the culminating activity or answering the key questions, when you are, just use the highlighter here. So when you are answering the questions, what I want you to do is I want you to use the provided information along with your own knowledge, so what you already know and what you have experienced. I do not want you to use the internet or Wi-Fi to look up answers. Okay, so if you have access to internet or Wi-Fi, you don't need to do that, because the questions or the answer to the questions are in the provided information. So that means you don't really need to go anywhere to look for the answers. Okay, so here's what we have done so far. Like I said, this might be different. The first question, key question, match the correct letter to the 4 concepts of historical thinking. That may be different from last year's format, where I asked you to identify and describe. So this one, you're just matching the correct letter. Number 2, I asked you what was the significance of the Boer War to Canada. So you can start off your answer, the significance of the Boer War to Canada, then you tell me. Number 3, give 2 examples. So you only need to provide 2 examples of what women were required to do as immigrants. So you can say 2 examples of what women were required to do, and then write your 2 examples. Okay, next up, give 2 examples of how racism influenced Canada's immigration policies. So the key word here is policies. Not how people felt about them, but we're looking specifically at Canada's immigration policies. What did the government do? Okay, to to answer. So remember how people felt about certain immigrants from different countries. So how did Canada's immigration policies, how was that influential in how they governed at that time? So remember, we looked at one already. We said that okay, they imposed a Chinese, oops, let me just, I forgot the word head. They imposed a Chinese head tax, okay, to the Chinese. So no one else had, no other countries that came to Canada had that imposed on them. So it went from $50, then $100, that was in 1900, and then $500 in 1903. And from 1901 to 1918, 18 million was collected from Chinese immigrants. So they couldn't afford the head tax, which meant that they couldn't immigrate to Canada. Okay, so that's one example. So you have to give me two. So remember, it's a policy that I'm looking at. Okay, let's continue to the next topic here. We're looking at Indigenous peoples in the early 20th century. So that's on page 13. Here are some key points to look at, or keywords: the word colony and the word assimilation. So Canada and Canadians, they saw themselves as a colony dependent on Britain. Okay, they didn't feel that it was their own country because they were colonized by Britain. The colonizers in Canada, they wanted to form a national identity. Indigenous people were fighting to preserve their own identities. They wanted their own culture. So Canada's relationship with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities was shaped by the government policies of assimilation. So assimilation means when one group of people adopt the cultural norms of another. So the goal of assimilation was to make Indigenous peoples blend in. Okay, they didn't want them to have their own identity. They wanted them to be assimilated with the dominant European settler society, which meant that it would erase their unique identities. The Indian Act was passed by the Canadian government in 1867. And this act banned traditional Indigenous religious, spiritual, and cultural practices. So again, it was created in 1876. A new version was created in 1951. And since then, the act has been revised several times. But the main goal of the act was to force First Nations people to lose their culture and become like Euro-Canadians. So Duncan Campbell Scott, he was the head of Indian Affairs from 1913 to 1932. He stated that the primary objective for Indigenous peoples was assimilation. Okay, so he didn't want them to preserve or continue their tradition or culture. The First Nations of Canada tried to obtain an official Aboriginal title. They were denied in Canada, so the leaders took matters to the King Edward VII of England. Now, King Edward had the final say in all matters regarding Canada. He too refused to legally and politically recognize Indigenous peoples as a distinct and unique group. So you can see a picture here. So this is an example of assimilation. Okay, they wanted them not to dress the way they want to, or dress in their traditional ways. They wanted them to be assimilated. Okay, the other word we used was the word colony, and that will come up a couple of times. Colony means a country or area under the full or partial political control of another country, typically a distant one and occupied by settlers from that country. So you can see here there's the British flag. Okay, and so this is Britain, but it has all these colonies, and it's not even in Britain, it's somewhere else. Okay, that's what colony means. Okay, next up, still on page 13. Okay, our treaties. So treaty, that is an agreement or an arrangement made by negotiation. So for example, a contract in writing between two or more political authorities or parties, and it's formally signed by their representatives and duly recognized as binding. Okay, so it's an agreement. So why were they negotiated? Remember, that's one of the questions we had. Why were treaties negotiated? Well, we have between 1871 and 1921, the Canadian government signed several treaties with First Nations. So in this case, the treaty is a formal agreement where First Nations gave up their land rights, okay, except for the reserves, and in return received money and other forms of government assistance. The Crown signed 11 treaties, known as the numbered treaties, and they're divided into two groups. So you have those for settlement in the south, and then those for access to natural resources in the north. Treaties 1 to 7, these concluded between 1871 and 1877. This led the way to opening the lands of the Northwest Territories up to agricultural settlement. It also opened up the construction of the railway linking British Columbia to Ontario and solidifying Canada's claim on the lands north of the border with the United States. So these treaties gave the Canadian government access to lands for settlers and the resources. So you can see the different numbered treaties. You can see some of the towns, cities. You can see Winnipeg there, so that's close to us. Numbered treaties 1 to 5. Numbered treaties 6 to 7. You got numbered treaties from 8 to 11. Okay, so what happened with having the treaties? Each treaty delineated a specific tract of land whose title was held by a First Nation, and then in exchange for surrendering their rights to the land, First Nations were promised a smaller parcel of land as a reserve. They are given annual annuity payments, implements to either farm or hunt and fish, and the right to continue to hunt and trap or trap and fish on the tract surrendered. With epidemics and famine striking their people, Aboriginal leaders wanted the government to help care for their distressed people and assist them in adapting to their changing economic reality as the buffalo herds neared extinction. So what was the government's motivation? So why did they want to sign these treaties? Well, they can continue their plan to control and gradually change Indigenous peoples' way of life. So again, the assimilation that's the word. Okay, they're wanting to change their way of life by creating reserves. These were special areas of land where Indigenous peoples could hunt and fish, but they thought that by signing these treaties, they're protecting Indigenous peoples, but what they're doing is they're also controlling their education and pushing them to adopt farming instead of traditional ways. So the first treaties guaranteed Aboriginal bands a reserve of their choice. So land grants range from 160 to 640 acres per family of 5, schools, annual payments of around $5 per person, livestock and farming tools, ammunition, seeds, and the right to hunt and fish in unoccupied land. Aboriginal peoples also insisted that the government provide education and instruction in farming. So today in Canada, there are approximately 70 treaties between 371 First Nations and the Crown. The treaties represent the rights of more than 500,000 Indigenous people. Ontario is covered by 46 historic and present-day treaties, which were signed between 1781 and 1930. This year, Treaties Recognition Week will take place from November 3rd to the 9th. Okay, then on page 14, we have residential schools. So Indigenous people in Canada saw a great value in education. So in fact, during many treaty negotiations, the First Nation leaders insisted that education be included. So the federal government took that responsibility for providing educational services to Aboriginal children. In mid-1800s, the government began establishing what would become the residential school system. This system or schools were funded by the government, but they were operated by the Catholic, Anglican, Presbyterian, and United Churches. By 1931, the churches were operating 80 residential schools across the country, as well as day schools on some reserves. So again, for the federal government, this was another feature in its policy of assimilating Aboriginal people into mainstream society. So they removed children from their homes and had them live in these residential schools. Their belief was that this was the best way to assimilate the children and to separate them from their families, communities, and culture. They thought that by doing this, that they were promoting economic self-sufficiency by teaching Aboriginal children to become farmers and laborers. And then the goal of the missionaries that taught at these schools was to convert the children to Christianity. And children were often severely punished for practicing traditional spiritual beliefs. So a lot of the Indigenous parents, they sent their children to the schools because they wanted them to receive an education. Many parents believed their children needed the skills to participate in the new economy and society. So you can see a couple of pictures here. This one was from the CTV News. And here's a picture of the Pelican Falls Residential School in 1939. That was in the Sulaka Bulletin, February 5th, 2003 edition. So more than 150 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children were placed in these schools, and often they were against their parents' wishes. It had a lasting impact, meaning that the students received a poor education at residential schools. In 1945, for example, few students completed grade 9, and over 40% of the teaching staff that were teaching had no professional training. Children died of illnesses or caught diseases, such as tuberculosis, that destroyed their health, in an environment where they were often poorly fed and ill-treated. Students did not learn well, so parents began withdrawing their children from the schools and refusing to participate in the system. However, schools were not phased out. That means they didn't get rid of them. However, until the 1960s, and residential schools have had a devastating long-term effect on Aboriginal people and their communities. It broke the connection between the children and their parents and their culture. Many children, after the enforced isolation and anti-Aboriginal instruction, rejected their past, and others suffered from the effects of physical, sexual, and psychological abuse. So the one that was in Sulukau, the Pelican Day School, it opened in 1911 and it closed in 1973. So you can see some of these are what we call, if you remember back in the beginning of lesson 1, we talked about historical evidence. So you have pictures here, you have visual evidence, okay, what it was like back then for these children. Okay, let's see what we can complete in our key questions before we go. We can do key question 5. What are treaties and what did it give the Canadian government? So this has a two-part, or this question has two parts. The first part is asking you what are treaties, and then the second part is asking you what did it give the Canadian government. So the first part you need to answer. So treaties are, okay, so that's the first part. And then the second part is it gave, okay, the Canadian government. And then you tell me what the answer is for that. So let's look at our checklist again when you're continuing your work. Okay, so key question 4 you should do, and then key question 5, what are treaties and what did it give the Canadian government? So this is what you should have so far in lesson 1 completed, so that you can keep track of the key questions that you need to do. So again, if that's the route you're taking, is doing the key questions, make sure that you try them all so that it will prepare you to do the culminating. Then for those of you who want to start with the culminating, all you have to do is again contact myself or Bonnie, and we will send you the culminating activity. There are 5 of them, depending on how many you need for your equivalent credit. There's a PLAR history, PLAR English, PLAR science, PLAR geography, and PLAR math. So give us a call if you want to try the culminating activities instead of doing the lessons. And tomorrow, as I said, PLAR English will be at a different time because Bonnie and I will be in Wapakika. So if we have any Wapakika students listening, we will be there to take registration and to give out culminating activities for those people who chose to do it. Okay, so that's it for me. I will talk to you again on Thursday.